It's at this point in the course that we have to start talking about a really, really important subject that has to do with matte painters and environment artists dealing with projections, and that is overscan. So, what is overscan? Overscan is simply the pixels outside of the image area. So, if this were our plate right here, then all of the pixels outside of the plate's image area would be considered overscan. So matte painters always use overscan. There's very few instances when a matte painter would not, or an environment artist would not use overscan. And that means that when there is a matte painting created, it is larger than the plate. As to why we need overscan in matte paintings, I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later in the video. But you should know from the very beginning that there are two primary methods for getting overscan. And the first one is what we're going to be spending most of this video talking about, is changing the focal length. And the second one is reformatting the image area. Once you understand how focal length works and how to use it to create overscan, then the second method of reformatting the image area is going to be a lot more clear to you. And so we're going to be taking it in that order. So let's go ahead and start talking about focal length. So what is focal length? I'm going to throw a couple definitions out at you, and we're going to be talking about each one. So the first one is it's the distance between the center of a lens or a curved mirror and its focus. Okay, so what they're talking about there with that definition is that it's the mechanical pieces of the actual physical camera. So that doesn't really mean much to us as visual effects artists because we don't deal with real physical cameras. We deal with digital cameras. And when I say digital cameras, they're just pieces of code in Maya or in Nuke or some other software package. Maybe a better definition for visual effects artists is that it's the thing that controls the angle of view. So if you're not familiar with what the angle of view is, maybe a better definition would be it controls how much or how little we see out of the camera lens. And if we were going to bring this home to specifically matte painters and environment artists, we would say that it's a way to provide overscan. And that's the ultimate reason for affecting the focal length, is to provide overscan for your projections. As to why we need overscan for our projections, we're going to be talking about that in just a minute. You know that first definition that we talked about that didn't really mean much to us as visual effects artists? Well, it doesn't in one sense, but we need to understand the principles behind how cameras work in order to understand how focal length works. So you can see here at this diagram of this camera that right there in the back is the image sensor. So the image sensor is what's going to be recording the images that are seen through the lens. And right here in front is the optical center. So the distance between the optical center, which is in the middle of the lens, to the image sensor is the focal length. Now, the way that you can change your focal length is changing the distance between the optical center and the image sensor. And the way that you do that is with your lens. Every lens comes with millimeter settings where you can either move the optical center forward or move it back. The result of changing your focal length will either bring you closer into what you're looking at or pull you farther away. So if you look here at the top left, this is an 18 millimeter lens. So with that, we can see a lot of the landscape. And we're focusing in here on this little barn. As we keep going through different types of lenses, we get closer and closer until we get to the 300 millimeter, where we see less of what is in front of us. So the point here is that if you want to control what you see, the lower the number is the wider the angle of the camera. The higher the number is you pushing in to what you're trying to see. So I've been saying either you're going to see more of what's in front of you or less of what's in front of you. Another way of saying that is that either you have a wide angle or you have a narrow angle. Okay, so if you look here at this diagram, the 14 millimeter, the smaller the number, the more wide the angle is. And the higher the number, the more narrow the angle of the camera is. Now that we've talked about focal length and how cameras work, we can talk about why we adjust the focal length for projections. The first of these reasons is to provide coverage for camera shake during a static shot. The second reason is to provide coverage for a camera move. The third is to minimize doubling and smearing. And the fourth reason is that opening the focal length will work with any 3D application. So if you're moving from one application to the other, it's going to be seamless and it's going to work through all of those. However, there are other ways of providing overscan that doesn't have to do with the focal length. We're going to be talking about those later in the course. So let's talk about that first one, providing coverage for camera shake. So oftentimes in films, if there's a static shot, there's going to be some kind of camera shake, okay? In this plate right here that you see, this plate has a matte painting in it. Let's say that there's some additional things that are added here in the distance, okay? And this dotted line represents the matte painting. So the matte painting has been made to the exact size as the plate, okay? But the plate is not static. It's going to be moving around. So when the camera moves just a little bit and you've made your matte painting to be exactly the same size as the frame, then on different places in the frame, you're going to be missing matte painting. So that's as opposed to providing a bunch of overscan so that when the camera shakes, there's matte painting back there that you'll be able to see. One of the other reasons that you would get more overscan by adjusting the focal length for your projections is to do a coverage projection or to make sure you have enough coverage. So if you have, like in this image, a camera that's panning up from the top of this building down to this woman with the blanket, then you'll want to have both of those projections set so they have overscan and overlap and there's enough coverage for the whole camera move. The last reason for opening your focal length that we're going to be talking about is to minimize the doubling and smearing. So let's say you have a camera passing in between two buildings, and you have two cameras that you can choose from to use as your projection camera. So the first one, you stop your shot camera at frame 50, and then you open the focal length just a little bit, and you have quite a narrow angle of view. Or you could go to frame 100, which is later in the shot sequence, and you open the focal length quite extremely. So the question is, which one of these is going to have the least amount of doubling and smearing? So let me show you some images here. So this is the wide angle on the left, and this is the render that has come from this camera. And you can see that you can see on the insides of these windowsills, and because the angle of view is so extreme, right? This one, on the other hand, has the narrow angle of view, and you cannot see on the inside of these windowsills. So like this window, for example, half of the window pane is getting cut off. So when you compare the two lenses on these cameras, you can see the one with the really wide angle of view compared to the very narrow angle of view, that this one is going to have a much better time projecting and minimizing the doubling and the smearing. So the last thing that we need to discuss when talking about opening the focal length to create more overscan is how do we match what's in the plate to what is in the overscan. So let's say this is our plate and the dotted line represents our matte painting with overscan. And so what we need to do on this shot is extend this house right here because the camera pans over, okay? So this is our extra bit of house. We need to make sure that what we paint into the overscan exactly lines up with what is going on in the plate. So let me explain to you the cool thing about how focal length works. So let's say I'm standing at the top of this hill taking a photo of this beach, and I have a tripod and I have a lens that goes from 18 millimeters down to 100 millimeters. and I took photos of 18 all the way down to 100. Okay. And now what I could do is I could take my 50 millimeter photo, which would be this photo with none of this, right? Just the red. And I could take that photo, shrink it down, and put it on top of my 18 millimeter photo, and it would match up exactly. Okay. And so that's the really cool thing about focal length, is that if I know that this is going to be my shot, I can open up the focal length from, this is a 50 to a 35 millimeter, and I can put whatever I want back here, and it's going to exactly line up with the plate. So let me explain to you the workflow that you would go through in order to provide the overscan through the focal length and have everything work out seamlessly. So let's say that you are in Nuke right now and you want to go into Photoshop to paint on top of the matte painting. Okay. So this is your frame right here. It's 35 millimeter. That's what this plate was shot with. And the resolution is 2048 by 1080. Now you need to figure out how much overscan that you need in order to paint your house. And so you've determined that if you set your focal length to 30 millimeters, then that provides you enough room. So if your plate is 35 millimeters, and this is the resolution for 35 millimeters, if you open up the focal length to 30 millimeters, what does the resolution of this outside box or your overscan need to be? Okay. And that's what you need to be able to determine. If this is the right resolution, then you will be able to take your plate and put it right in the middle of your Photoshop file. And when you paint a stroke from over here to in here, then on this frame, it will exactly match up. So now let's say you're in Photoshop and you need to go into Nuke. So in Photoshop, you have your plate and it is 2048 by 1080, and you open up your canvas to 3868 by 2040, and that allows you enough room to paint the extension on this house. So the question is, what is the focal length of the camera that you need to have in Nuke for this to work out? So if you can figure this out, then it will be seamless. If at this point you're feeling just a little bit foggy about how focal lengths work and how to use them as a matte painter or environment artist, don't worry, because I'm going to be walking you through this whole workflow of being able to take a plate from Nuke and into Photoshop, and from Photoshop into Nuke. And once you see the step-by-step process and the actual application of these principles in a software package, then it's all going to come together for you. So with that, let's get started.